Grand evening, everyone. It's great to have another great level of attendance for hopefully some good discussion later on. So welcome to this Farm Advisory Service webinar as part of the Sustainable Sheep Systems series. Tonight's webinar titled Low Labour Input Genetics. Tonight's webinar, well, we're going to run for about probably an hour and a quarter, finishing about 8:45. Yeah, you're going to hear a bit from me, looking at where's the labour coming from within the sheep system, sort of where do we need to be at, some thoughts about breeding. And then I'm going to pass you on to our guest speaker tonight, Tim White from Sheep Improvement Group. Tim is a founding member of SAC, who developed the wool shedding composite maternal breed, the Exlanas, down in the southwest of England. The group takes a data-driven approach to selection with EBVs, including worm resistance, driving genetic gain alongside strong selection pressure for functional, low labour, high welfare traits, and wool shedding ability, with the motto, genetics not cosmetics. And all of this has won Tim the Farmers Weekly Sheep Farmer of the Year in 2021. Just to highlight as well, all previous webinars in this series and past series, so all the Sustainable Sheep webinars we've done to date are all on the FAS YouTube channel. And you can hear back from this previous series, we've had Yoni's, lameness, and blowfly strike. And upcoming as well, on the 20th of February, we are excited to have Mark Ferguson, founder and CEO of Next Gen Agri International, to talk to us about the work they've done looking at blowfly and foot rot resistance in sheep. So breeding a sheep that is less susceptible to getting foot rot and getting struck, and also the development of EBVs and scoring systems over there. And Mark and Next Gen Agri work closely with stud breeders across New Zealand and Australia to develop, implement, and support data-driven breeding strategies for more disease-resistant, higher welfare productive sheep. And I think that disease resistance factor as well is a really important one when we're looking at labour efficiencies as well, in terms of, we think about how much of our time is spent treating sheep with bad feet, treating struck animals, routine worming, for example. So there's huge scope there to reduce labour. Again, as always, we'd ask if you've got any questions, please put it in the Q&A. And if you've got any direct questions for us, for example, any tech support, please put it in the chat. And as always, please do the feedback forms. It really does help us improve and identify opportunities for what you're interested in and future topics. So tonight, I thought I'd just take sort of 10-15 minutes to look at some of the labour factors and the profitability factors within a sheep flock. But I suppose before we think about the why do we need low input genetics or low labour genetics? I think probably also considering what the how can certain genetics be lower labour? I think ultimately that comes down to their need for intervention, for human assistance, and for their suitability to lower labour grass-based outdoor lambing systems. If we consider labour, probably the first thing people think about is the big mission of lambing. But we know that if we can breed a sheep that's got improved ease of lambing, we've got lambs that jump up and have good vigour and good survival instinct with usually good maternal ability, we can have a sheep that needs much less intervention. Not only does that help us in an indoor lambing system, but it also facilitates a move to an outdoor lambing system with lower labour, but equally it is important for indoor lambing systems as well. Our next thought probably comes to the marking time and all that routine disease control. But we know we can actually breed sheep for reduced tail length. We can breed for the sheep potentially doesn't need docking. We know we can breed sheep and cull for sheep for improved resistance to worms, to fly site, to foot rot. And ultimately that means that we could potentially reduce the number of gathers and the amount of intervention that we need to give those sheep, so we can run more ewes per labour unit. We can also finish lambs faster, so they're less time on farm, ultimately reducing the amount of time we have to take lambs in, again, more routine treatments, and again, more drafting to finish lambs. And finally, as well, we can have stock that potentially can fit a system on a reduced supplementation basis. And for that, ideally, we'd have more robust, easier flesh genetics to suit that system. So why do we need that? Why do we need sheep that potentially take less labour? I think ultimately it comes down to that economic viability, to either be able to run more ewes per labour unit, or in a given flock size, reduce our time that we input. So to justify labour if we're paying, or to pay ourselves a realistic wage. Also, if we need to facilitate scaling up without an excremental increase in the amount of labour that we require. And potentially, if we're looking to change a system, we need a type of genetics that's going to suit that system. For example, of outdoor lambing, we need to have genetics that are easily lambed with good maternal ability to suit that system. And it's not just financials, it's also about that work-life balance as well. So having a sheep that needs less input can free up potentially more time for personal aspects, and that's hugely important to our emotional well-being as well. But I would also add to that that there's a lot of frustrating tasks and maybe perhaps upsetting tasks for some involved in a lot of the sheep system side of things. And actually, if we have a stock that needs less input, potentially with improved welfare, it can also improve our emotional well-being as well, and we have more time off. And as well, to encourage the next generation to join the business. I've often quite a few meetings recently, I've heard that young people don't want to join or don't want to farm or don't want to work. But I think we also have to consider that maybe often it's just that they don't want to, for example, work sheep's feet on a Sunday morning. And actually what we need to encourage them is a sheep system that is lower labour, that, has that system in place. And it's less work and ultimately reducing some of those mundane tasks involved in the system. I thought it'd be interesting, and it's not easy to actually find a lot of kind of labour statistics. What I did find was the stock take data from HDB, which is the precursor to Farm Bench. I thought there's some interesting stats in there. So we're back to 2016. But it really is quite a comprehensive data set full of financials and KPIs, and I've drawn some of them out tonight. Ultimately, what we can see here, so this is SDA lowland type flocks, and it's the profitability per ewe. And what we can see is a vastly different profitability between the bottom third performing flocks, the average, and the top third. Interestingly, what we can see in this year and in this, survey was that actually there was no differences in net output per ewe in terms of the driver of profitability. And in fact, actually, the top third actually had slightly lower performance. But I would highlight that's not what we generally see, particularly in more recent Scottish data. There is an improvement in net output. But like this, the key driver is ultimately cost control. So our ability to reduce our cost of production and make an improved margin. So produce stock off grass at lower cost. What we can see then is our total variable costs are about half in the top third of performing flocks. And a key driver of that is this purchase feed, so making more from forage and reducing our reliance on purchased inputs. And that's a clear factor in more recent costing as well. It's interesting to note that vet and med is also half in the top third of performing flocks. But again, we don't actually see that in the Scottish data from QMS that we'll look at in a minute. What I wanted to highlight here, though, and I think this is the real value of this HDB stock take data, is that it pulls in not just paid labour, but also unpaid labour. And what we can see here is a vast difference in both the labour paid labour, and also unpaid labour between the bottom third and the top third of performing flocks. And actually, that's actually the biggest cost when you add the two together in the whole system. So the top third of performing flocks have almost half, or at least half, the amount of labour required per ewe, and that is driving significant improvement in profitability, along with reductions in cost. And we look at some more of the stats. If we look at net margin less labour on pounds a ewe, as I was saying earlier on, we can see a significant difference. But actually, when we look at the total labour costs combined, so in this system, the inputted based on unpaid labour, on an assumed cost per hour, what we can see is that the top third of producers use half the labour per ewe, and that's a significant profit driver in this flock. And to break that down, we can look at the total hours per ewe. We see that actually it is literally half. So the bottom third of flocks take 3.8 hours per ewe in the full production year, compared to the average of 2.5 and 1.9 in the top third. And actually, in more detailed analysis of 4 years of stock take data, they found an average of 5.2 hours per ewe, with the best being 1.8. So I think consistently we're thinking that 2 hours per ewe, and the worst being as much as 11.3 hours per ewe. So it's a huge investment in time and labour into these flocks. What they did find consistently was there is a key driver in terms of flock size and that efficiency of labour use. So scaling up doesn't necessarily take proportionally as much labour if you've already gathered the sheep in, for example. But what we also see again is that these flocks are driven profitability-wise by an improvement in the number of weeks grazing, so a reduction in supplementation, and a reduction in reliance in terms of purchase concentrates. But it is interesting to note that for the February-March lambing flocks, we saw an improvement of 2.5 down to 2.1 hours per ewe in the average compared to the top third, but actually there was no difference in total labour required. So it's not just economies of scale, there is flocks that are more efficient in their labour use. Now, just to break that down and kind of take it down to some more modern costings, I think it's interesting to look at, well, where does that sit? What does 4 hours per U mean? What does taking it down to 2 hours per U actually mean in terms of cost of production? And if we consider that we can find someone with a skill set and that would also take minimum wage, so we're saying £10.42 for agricultural minimum wage, at 4 hours per labour unit per U, that would be £40 per U versus £20 per U. So we can see where we're really driving the opportunity here. And when we look at up-to-date QMS costings, so this is net margins less labour in 2021, we can see that at £40 a U, in no way can we cover those costs of productions. And even at the average income net per U less labour, we would actually equal the amount if we were working at 4 U's per U. So we can see that there's an absolute need to generate or to improve our labour efficiency in sheep flocks. If we then compare that down and we say, well, what does 4 hours per U mean? What does that mean in terms of our number of ewes that we could carry? What we can see then is that based on 1900 hours per annum, which is about an 8-day, 5 days a week, plus including some holidays, we're looking at about 500 ewes per annum per labour unit for 3.8 hours a week versus 1,000 ewes at 1.9. Now, I thought it'd be interesting to consider, well, what does that mean in terms of if we were going to pay a shepherd? So I've got a flock, I can pay a shepherd. Well, what does that mean in terms of being able to generate profitability from that shepherd's wage, I suppose, and our ability to cover that wage? And what we can see, for example, if we're paid a shepherd's wage of £33,000, perhaps it might be slightly lower, but there might be benefits in terms of tied housing or a pickup, and it might be higher again quite easily. We can see that covering 500 ewes per labour unit, we would set at a cost per ewe of £66, which ultimately is going to be impossible to actually generate returns. I should add that this is without subsidy, all these costs, and in an age where we know and we see what's happening in England with significantly reduced costs with a view of eliminating it, we really need to look at how we can produce sheep systems that are profitable without subsidy. And ultimately, why wouldn't we, even with subsidy, want to generate more income and more profitability? But if we can get to that stage where our labour efficiency is such that we can set that shepherd up to run 1,000 ewes, we can see that we can take that labour unit down to about £33. So we can see, thinking back to those previous costings, labour really is a key driver of profit. It's such a big cost in the sheep system. Now we think, well, I don't pay a shepherd, I pay myself, or I don't pay myself perhaps. Where do we then sit in terms of net margin profitability? I should note as well that this 2021 data looks pretty good. We can see that the bottom third of flocks are achieving a net margin without labour of about £15, whilst the top are achieving a very substantial net margin of £65 per labour unit. But I think it is important to note that this is the year where the lamb prices really did jump up, and actually the year before, 2020, the net margin is exactly half that shown there. So bear that in mind when we go through the next bit of costings. So we now need to think, well, if I've got one labour unit then, and I've said that based on my labour units, if I'm efficient, I can run 2 hours a ewe, I can run 1,000 ewes, or I can run 4 hours per ewe and run 500 ewes. Where do I then sit in terms of net margin profitability, or sorry, ultimate wage when I factor those prices in? And actually what we see is if we're in the bottom third of performing producers, we can't make a wage even comparable to those of a shepherd's wage. And we at least need to be in that average profitability, running somewhere around 760 ewes if we're on an average level of profitability. But we can boost that up to quite a considerable sum, sitting at about 65k, if we can combine top third performance and a net margin of over 1,000 ewes, so we've got good labour efficiency. And that's without subsidy. But bearing in mind that I said the last year was actually roughly half of that profitability. So I think ultimately what we need to think about going forward is how can we drive that labour efficiency? And we can also see there, we can convert that into an hourly rate, and we can see how efficient, profitability-wise, and labour we need to be to generate ourselves a good hourly rate. And I should also sort of note here as well, the QMS figures don't include certain things like land equivalency. So there's actually probably additional costs on top of those costs that you can see. And it's not that I'm suggesting that every flock needs to be 1,000 ewes, but I think particularly when we're looking forward with reducing subsidy payments for smaller flocks, like we are at home, where we're nowhere near 1,000 ewes, that we need to look at our labour efficiency, at least targeting that 2 hours per annum or better, so that we can go for a 1,000 ewe equivalency payment, so that yes, we don't have 1,000 ewes, but the time that we invest is relative to that, so that we can provide a viable return and free up time for non-sheep farming enterprises and work-life balance. Or at a lower ewe number per livestock unit, achieve well above the top third of performance commercially, or look to add value. That could be, for example, breeding, sales, or direct marketing. So I mean, these aren't exact figures I think we need to look at. We just need to have that, bear that in mind when we're looking at it. And I think a key part of that is the genetics that we're running, as we said earlier on, and considering, are my genetics an enabler or a hindrance? We know that things like farm design, infrastructure, handling, and all economies of scale are all going to play a part, but so do genetics, particularly when we're considering changing a system, transitioning a system, to example, to our outdoor lambing system. The genetics are going to be a key component of that. And for example, we've got a case study here, just to flag it up. This is our first meeting as part of the Sustainable Sheep Systems in person, where we were kindly hosted by the Maxwell family at Ruefield Romneys, where they run about 3,000 Romney ewes. And the key thing I'll point out here is they've moved all the stock to an all-out wintered system, all-out lambed as well. Ewes are running big mobs of over 1,000 ewes on pasture and kale through the winter. So there's a high stocking density, high mob pressure in terms of the stock meaning to compete and maintain condition in that environment. Ewes are also culled heavily for health traits to reduce time. But I think the key one I really want to flag up here is where they've got their lambing ease assistance down to only 5 ewes assisted in 2023, when they're lambing down almost 3,000 ewes. So that's less than 1 ewe per 100. You know, it's 2 ewes in every 1,000 that they're lambing at this scale. And at that point, in no way is that genetics a hindrance to their ability to scale up. I think that's important to think. If you think about your current system now, have a thought of, are my current genetics an enabler or a hindrance to me either reducing the labor per ewe, so I can free up more time with the given flock size, or are they going to be a hindrance towards me scaling up if I need to maintain viability, or that's what I'm aiming for in my business? How are my genetics fitting into that future system? That's all I'll say about the maternal side of things, because we couldn't have anyone better than Tim to discuss that coming up. I just wanted to read a couple of slides here, also focusing on our low labour terminal sire side of things, because what we don't want in our quest for improved output using a terminal sire is actually it to become a hindrance to, as we've said before, our ability to scale up, or our ability, for example, to transition a system, to example, for outdoor lambing. And the first thing I think everyone will think about there is, well, we need outdoor lambing, I need an easy lamb terminal sire. And again, old statistics, but I think a really good graph which just shows each bar is a ram, and at the left-hand side, we've got percentage of lambs assisted. And of course, there's a breed difference there. But actually, what we can see between the Blackface and the Suffolk sires, so each one's a sire, and that's their offspring percentage of assisted. What we can see actually is there's probably more variation within a breed than between a breed. So we need the ability to be able to select within a breed for improved lambing traits, with some tops well up into over half the lambs being assisted. And I would highlight here that yes, there is a lambing ease EBV, but actually I think on this scenario, what you really want to do is find a stud breeder who is breeding sheep in the same system that you're in, and that you know is outdoor lambing, or at the very least putting a high selection pressure on those lambing traits, lambing ease, lamb vigor, recording them and ultimately culling on those lambing traits. But it's not just about the functional side of things that would make a terminal sire help you in terms of lambing, in terms of labour efficiency, but also we think about terminal growth as well. And I'll just highlight a couple of slides here about the Ram Compare project, which I think is well worth looking at. Just give it a Google. It's on the HDB and the Signet websites. Here we're looking at year 6 results. So Ram Compare projects, terminal sire offspring performance on commercial farms, where they're giving commercial farms pretty big scale, giving them a range of high index terminal sires of a range of breeds, and they're running them in commercial systems, and they're verifying the impact of how the genetics, so the EBVs of those terminal sires in terms of scan, 8-week weights, muscle and fat depth, are relating in terms of the performance in those lambs in terms of days to slaughter, and following them through into abattoir data. And what they've found, and we'll show a slide in a minute, is a really good strong correlation. So we know now that yes, the EBVs work, they do deliver higher performance lambs on the ground. When we're thinking about low labour, we think about, well, ultimately a huge factor for flocks that finish lambs will be that time spent taking lambs in, handling lambs, disease control, and drafting lambs out for sale. And actually what they found on two really good case study farms, the first one at Chawton Park, they found that comparing high and low performing terminal sires, that the high group had lambs that finished 24 days sooner than the lower performing terminal sires. And I would highlight that no stud breeders were putting forward really low index terminals to be used in the project. So actually this is a variation between pretty high genetic merit stock in the first place. And an even greater transparency was found with Adrian Coombe at Duppeth Farm, where they found a 30-day difference between terminal sires used. In some cases, you might be accepting a slightly lower weight, for example, of carcass weight, but if we're looking at labour, looking at days to slaughter, the cost of production, there's significant opportunities here. We think that another 3 to 4 weeks is probably another gather, it's probably another wormer. So we can considerably reduce our labour input using this through purchase of high index sires. Another plug for previous Sustainable Sheep Systems content was the video that we did with Duncan Nellis at Thistley Haw, looking at their findings at the RAM Compare project. And one of the slides that he presented on a previous data-driven decision-making webinar that we did back in the autumn, we can see this as a slide which shows days to slaughter up the left and scan weight to the right. And it showed on their farm and their data, which is about 4,500 lambs, that there was a strong correlation between the scan weight EBV, so that's the second weight EBV that you get after 8-week weight, you get scan weight EBVs for terminal sires, that there was a strong correlation between that and days to slaughter. So picking out rams with high EBVs generated lambs which finished. On their flock, which achieves pretty unbelievable levels of lamb finishing performance, the top 10%, the top 10 rams over the 6 years, that they did the project and still are doing the project, those lambs finished at 99 days compared to the bottom 10% where they had 109 days. So that's 10 days, which doesn't sound much, but in their system with such high performance, those high genetic merit rams were finishing 10%, had lambs that finished 10% faster. So it was a consistent reduction in the number of days and the amount of inputs that they'd have to put into those lambs. And as Duncan says in the video, he says it really is a no-brainer to purchase high index terminal sires. So when we're thinking about labour, I think it's important that we look at the direct sort of labour saving traits, the lambing traits, functional traits, but also perhaps we need to look more at growth when we're considering whether we're tricking muscle or growth between the two in terms of selecting our terminal sires. And just final slide, just to look at the importance of looking at individual EBVs and not just picking out high index terminal sires. These are actually not, I was going to use my two rams at home, but these are actually the sires of the two rams because they've got even more extreme differences than we can see here. But what we can see is that if we went just simply for terminal sire index, we would pick the ram on the right, we'd pick SC Classic. We can see he's got 372 index points compared to SC Baldric at 354. So the index, which is a weighted number, it's a combination of different EBVs based on their economic value, would suggest overall for terminal sire traits of muscle and carcass traits and growth, we'd be better off picking SC Classic on the right. But actually, when we look down more and more detail and we look at the EBVs, we can actually see that if our objectives here, and it is at home, our objective is store lamb finishing, but your objective might be quicker lamb finishing, we'd actually be better off going for the ram on the left, which has a scan weight some 2.5 kilograms higher than the ram on the right. Not only that, he also has a lower or a more improved lambing ease EBV as well. So we can see the value there in terms of looking at more detail in terms of EBVs. And previously, we can see the value in using EBVs over just simply phenotypic selection if we want more consistent, high, fast finishing lamb crops. And I will now pass you over to Tim White.
Good evening. Good evening. Thanks for inviting me along. Can you hear me?
We're good.
Am I good? Good. Okay. All right. Okay. So I was asked to talk about low input genetics and what we did. And I'm not meant to be advertising the Exlana brand, so I'm just going to sneak one logo in here, so I've got it and done it, and that's the only place you'll see it. And I promise there'll be no subliminal messaging in the rest of my my presentation. So this slide sums up my approach to breeding. It's what I have in my head when I'm thinking about a breeding strategy. And it shows me all the things that are important when I'm breeding something, which is so selection intensity. So the more animals I can grow and measure, then the better I'm going to get at selecting for what I want. The better I measure them, so the more accurate I do it, the better. And the more genetic diversity I've used, the better. So it's no use just breeding animals that are almost identical. You've got to bring different things in all the time to try and improve. And that doesn't always work. But if you don't try, you never get anywhere. And then you want to create use more breeding cycles. So breeding from ewe lambs is really important, and from ram lambs. And then at the bottom in green there, I got selection under pressure. And this is really important. If you don't select under pressure, you don't ever find out who survives. So you've got to let lambs get really wormy, so you can find out who thrives under those conditions. And at lambing, it's no good putting all the ewes out as spread out as you can. You've got to give them really high stocking densities. You want 10, 15 twins or triplets to the acre, so you find out who's a good mum and who isn't a good mum. And the same kind of thing applies to foot rot. A breeder's got to have foot rot on the farm. He's got to have a foot rot problem so he can see who's susceptible and who isn't. And I think you mentioned earlier on, you've got to do all this on the kind of system that you're hoping to use these rams on. So in our case, that's grass and forage and a low input. So we use data to make all our selections and to improve all of these traits, and we need generations of data for the system to work. If you want to make decisions about carcass traits, then that's fairly simple. You can start as soon as you weigh a group of animals, you know who's growing quicker. But if you want to make decisions about maternal traits, like fecundity or mothering ability, lamb survival, you need a few generations. You need 4 generations of that of data before you can really get any reliable information. And you need to measure those traits across a broad spectrum of the flock as well. Don't just measure the good ones. You want to know about your failures. So you've got to record all those kind of animals. So that's my kind of basic ethos. That's what we try to do. If we can go to the next slide there, Daniel. So yeah, Daniel's been through all this, hasn't he? Labour's expensive. Many of the tasks are unnecessary. They all have an economic cost, and some have welfare implications. Labour isn't going to get cheaper. Things like docking, assisting lambing, worming, they can all be reduced with genetics. And welfare especially is more important than it ever was. And we need to look through the consumer's eyes, not through our eyes, when we define welfare. Something that you and I think is okay it's often not considered to be okay to the average punter. And the largest problem I see for low input and outdoor lambing flocks is lamb mortality. A lot of us are scanning 180, 190%, and we might only rear 160, 165%. That's a lot of dead lambs at or around lambing time. And we tend to kind of just think that's part of the game. But for the punters, for our ultimate customers, that doesn't look very good. So I think we've got to have a look at that one. So if we move on, genetic solutions are great because they reduce all the costs and do all the things we want them to do. And the most important thing about them is that they're permanent. So a worm-resistant sheep is resistant to worms throughout its life, and it passes that on to its offspring. Whereas if you use an anthelmintic, it kills the worms on the day, and that's it. They're growing again from then onwards. So genetic solutions are really important. So we'll move on. And the kind of a lot of the low labor traits can be summed up here. I think the 3 Ds: drenching, dagging, and docking. Drenching and worms is, it's the #1 welfare cost and cause of death in worldwide lamb production systems. Dagging and bear breach, it's just what a waste of time, and it's largely avoidable. And docking, the same applies. Genetic solutions are better than having to go out and dock lambs. So let's have a look at them. If we go on to the next one, we're looking at worms. And my understanding of worms and the problems of worms is changing, is developing all the time. And I'm learning more about it. And this is where I am at the moment. I like to define our approach to beating the worms as we're looking for a resilient animal. So resilient animal is an animal that just gets on with it. He's out there, the lamb's out there, and it grows. Doesn't matter what happens to it, it grows. And that's what we want. And they get to be resilient by doing 2 things. One is by being tolerant, and the other one's by being resistant. So tolerant animals, they'll have high worm burdens, but they still grow. The worms don't bother them. They just keep going. And resistant animals, they actually kill those eggs, those worms, as they get ingested. So they reduce them, destroy them, damage the worms, so that those worms don't function anymore. And we select for tolerance by subjecting the animals to really high worm burdens, by which I mean a minimum of 1,000 eggs per gram on mob counts, and weighing them over that period. So we then know which ones cope whilst they've got high worm burdens. Resistance we do in a different way. I'll come to that in a minute. And resistance is, I like resistant animals because they're the ones that reduce the worm burden for the flock. So they're really useful. If you've got a tolerant animal, he's got high worm burdens, but he still passes out lots of worms. And so other animals within the flock that are less tolerant get hammered by those worms. Whereas a resistant animal kills some of those worms, and so there's fewer worms out on the pasture. So let's go on, and we'll have a look at how we look at how we measure worm resistance. It's traditionally been quite hard to measure because we've been using fecal egg counts, and fecal egg counts are difficult to replicate. If you take a dung sample from a sheep today, if you do 2 samples from it, one probably come up at 320 and the next one will be 380 or something. So there's quite a bit of variation. So it's not a brilliant, it's not that accurate at all. And there's been poor take up by breeders in general, which is a pity. But we use FEC. It's also got, fecal egg counting's got a low heritability. So typically about 10% or lower, compared with most carcass traits that are about 30%. But we've started using IgA instead. So IgA is an antibody response that we can measure in sheep blood, and it's the response that the sheep makes against the larval stage of one member of the strongyle family, T circumcincta, and we use that as a marker for the kind of the host response to the infection. So the higher the IgA measure in a blood sample, the better the animals are at destroying worms. That has much higher heritability. So that's about 30%. So we can make good headway with that. Again, we've got to do this under pressure, and we've got to make it a priority trait, because it's one of the main problems in worldwide systems. And you know, I think that's half of the problem in the way as a country or as an industry we've approached it, is that most ram breeders don't select for it, and most people don't really think about it too much. So where does all this is all good stuff, this is recording, this is data and everything, where does it get us? We'll go on to the next one, which will show us, so having done all these thousands of egg counts over the years, and we're doing kind of 35% of lambs born, we're taking individual egg counts from, over probably about coming on 20 years now, I suppose. But in 2000, so 10 years ago, we had a look to see where we got to with it. The top 20% of animals that we predicted were going to be good at worm resistance were bunged in a paddock, along with the bottom 20%, and over from just before lambing until kind of weaning time, we measured the egg counts of the ewes and of the lambs, and we found that that the ones that we said were predicted to be really good were actually shedding half the amount of eggs that the bottom 20% did. So that actually, you know, that kind of shows that proves the point. It's actually doing something. It's not just numbers that we've come up with. So in the years since then, of course, we've progressed, and kind of practically, I can tell you that. So I've got a flock of Exlana sheep, and I've also got some terminal sire type sheep, Shartex things, that haven't been selected for parasite resistance. And all these animals run together. They're out in the same field all the time, apart from tupping time for about a month. And when I wean those lambs, and few weeks after weaning, I go around, if I follow the Exlana lambs around, they've got egg counts of kind of 150, 200 eggs per gram, whereas the Shartex animals, the unselected animals, have got egg counts of about 800. So that just shows you kind of in practical terms the difference that this selection process is making. And a lot of our farmers now, and their vets comment on it as well, is that these worm resistant genetics are kind of, they're equivalent to dropping one drench out on many customer farms, which is where we wanted to be with it. So that's where we got with worms. So we go to the next one on the D's, which was dags. Dags is all about excess wool in the wrong places. For me, any wool's in the wrong place, but I know not everybody's wants to breed that way. Lots of people like to have wool for one reason or another. But wool it costs you money, and it does create management tasks, and it can increase welfare problems in meat production systems. And primarily, at the moment, the UK is a meat production system. It's not a wool production system. So, and I could lead you through a cost of production for wool, but it'll just turn into a sales pitch, and I promise not to do that. So, we'll kind of skip away from the total wool thing, and we'll just have a look at the dags. So we all know why we don't want dags, because it increases fly strike risk. It means you've got to go and you've got to crutch them out. You've got to get your clippers out, and nobody wants to do that. So it's about having the right wool cover in the right place, clean bums, and useful tails. So we dag score. So if we go on to the next slide there, Daniel, we dag score all animals. Now with wool shedders, there ain't that much wool there, so you don't get too much in the way of dags. But if you take a flock of ewes and you put them under pressure, so you take, in this case, you take my 600 ewes and I run them off my permanent pasture in October, and they go on to dairy keep for overwinter. That dairy keep is very different, and it's very loose, and it goes straight through them. So I can force them to get daggy, and then I can dag score them. So then I can see the ones that are more susceptible to dags. So I'm putting those animals under pressure again. I do this, of course, with my woolly sheep as well, with my Shartex animals, and we've been kind of we've been doing the same thing with them, and I didn't find out the kind of statistics on it. I didn't look it up, but in 12 generations, which is about 15 years actually, we've gone from having the first lot of animals we bought in being a real problem to now not really having any dags at all. So let's move on from that, and we'll have a look at we'll just revisit the wool bit again. So in case you do want to get rid of wool, because wool is a big cause of labor on the farm, the biggest hurdle, I think, for farmers to get rid of wool production is their mindset. Actually, that's what it is. It's a very easy thing to do. 2 crosses takes the wool off most of your sheep breeds. So it doesn't take long to do it. It's very easy to see, you know, to find out which ones shed how you want them to. So these pictures here, it's the same 2 sheep from a different side, and the first one's got quite a bit of wool on. That's a half bred. That was a Flynn cross. I don't know, Flynn cross Wiltshire Horn, probably, I think, years ago. And the second one is the second cross. So the first one, you know, he's got a bare belly and a bare breech, and you know, he's quite handy. But the second one's is losing all its wool altogether. If you look at the right hand picture, you can see there's actually quite a bit of wool there. So there is, you know, there's an inch and a half of wool there that they're losing. And it's not just wool, it's wool and hair mix. So it comes out in little bits, and it soon disappears. If you did 2 crosses on your flock and got to a sheep like that, you would soon find that with a bit of selection, you'd get an animal that suited however much wool you thought you needed in your system, whether it's an inch or half an inch of wool over the winter. And these animals, they shed their wool when they want to, not when we get the shearers out. Another cost. They regulate their welfare, their heat, whenever they want to. So this, of course, does away with the need for shearing. It does away with the need for dagging to a large extent. But I think what people don't understand, the work that wool gives you, is a lot of it is about checking stock. If you drive around a flock of sheep and you're looking for fly strike, if they got a full fleece, it's quite hard to see, and it takes a bit of looking at. Whereas these animals, you know, they've got vastly reduced chance of getting fly strike, and B, it's really evident when they do get it, because it's quite a thin fleece there, and it shows up quite quickly. So that's enough about wool. let's have a look at docking, which is the next bit. It's another it's another bit of work that we have to do, and we should try to reduce it for a number of reasons. I think actually the most important one is increased welfare standards, or the customer perception of welfare. This will also protect our markets. You know, our largest export market is into the EU. Germany only permits docking in individual cases. Belgium only allows it in females and only performed by a vet. Netherlands, it's not permitted at all. Neither is it in Italy. So I think there's, you know, there could be future pressure for us to reduce this. So we can reduce or do away with tail docking, reduce the work, and we'll reduce the kind of infection potential, and the potential for fly strike and prolapse and joint ill and all the rest of it. It's just common sense, really. It's easy to measure, and it has high heritability, so it's fast progress. If we move on, we'll look at a couple of pictures. So look, these extreme difference there. The lamb on the right, his tail's only a few centimeters from the floor, whereas the other one is just above the hock. And go on to the next one, which will show us some more pictures of variable tail lengths. And there's a good example there. So there's an animal in the middle there with a tail just below its bum, almost down to the hock, and he's quite clean around the breech as well. He's quite clean around the edge. Whereas the one next to him, it's got a big fluffy tail which goes down a bit longer, and there's quite a bit of hair and wool around the bum. So then I've always got to decide about how long do I want a tail to be, and I look at some of the tails in the people, you know, when they dock tails, and they dock them, you know, only 5 or 6 centimeters long, which seems bizarre to me. We want enough to protect and cover the genitals. We want something to kind of swish the flies away. And we want it short enough not to get dung around it. And we want it clean skinned as well around the tail. And we can do it through genetics. So, and I've done this with my Shartex animals as well. And it is remarkably fast to make progress on it if you apply the selection pressure. If we move on quickly, and it will show you, look, so it's just different ones again. So the animal on the left is the Cameroon sheep, which is a completely different kettle of fish. I've got some for my sins. I'm not quite sure why, but they've got really clean and hairy tails and back ends and nice short tails, which might be something we can aspire to, something that doesn't need docking. And if you look at the sheep on the right, that's got a nice clean, it's got a clean breech around it as well, nice breech score. So let's nip on to the next one, which shows us how we score for tails. This looks like something I did in primary school. I didn't actually, I did it just the other day, but I've been using fairly low selection pressure on tails, and I've gone from a 2.2 to a 3.3 in 4 generations. So I'm selecting for obviously growth and maternal ability and worm resistance and foot rot resistance, all these things, as well as scoring for tails. So 2.2 is where I was 4 generations. Or this is an average over all the breeding sheep. And so that was kind of probably, I don't know, 4 centimeters below the hock. And now we're kind of 2 centimeters, 3 centimeters above the hock. So we're moving in the right direction. And actually, for me, I think we're getting kind of, you know, where I want to be, really. If I wanted to put more selection on it, more selection pressure, I'm sure I could get shorter if I wanted to. I've got animals that would score there between 4 and 5, which are really quite short, and actually I think they're probably plenty short enough, if not too short. So they're the kind of they're the different low labor traits that we look at in detail. So if we go on to the next slide, I just quickly listed all the other traits that I thought of that we did, which of course are a bit more obvious. I talked about one, which is lamb survival already, which I think is something that's coming round to bite us if we don't do something about it. All those lambs that are scanned in utero and the quite large amount that die close to birth, whether it's just because of mismothering or because of predators or because it's because they're triplets or whatever it is. I think we've got to address that in the future. We, of course, ease of birth is really important, and those figures earlier on of 5 in 2,000 ewes were pretty damn good, weren't they? I'd love to be there. I don't think I'm about that. I don't think I'm quite that good. But we need all these things measuring as well. Mothering ability. And one of the things that we also do is we measure foot rot, scold, and foot structure. So scold, when my little lambs are kind of 3 or 4 weeks old, there's usually a flush of grass and they get a bit of scold, and I tend to I catch them all and I score them for scold, so I know who's had scold, and those don't get bred from. So we record all that kind of stuff. It's not always easy to use immediately, but we're now using DNA parentage, and we've got the potential to use all this back data we've collected in a genomic assessment. And we can put wool shedding scores in there, which means that if people want to breed the wool off their sheep, then they can select rams that have quicker have offspring that shed their wool quicker. And we can do the same with foot scores. All that stuff, including individual treatments over the last 20-something years, we can put into the analysis, and it all will add accuracy to the genomic assessment we're going to do. So that's about it, really. If you move on to the next one, I can talk about I can just wrap it up. Okay, so I think out of the kind of low labor traits that we breed for, the health and welfare traits are probably the ones that we really should be looking at, because people haven't selected for them very well. Some of them are quite hard, and so they've been overlooked by breeders. FEC and RGA cost money to do. People don't want to do that, don't want to invest the money, but you can make good progress with these traits. And the traits that are so welfare traits are highly visible. If a sheep hasn't got foot rot, or rather if a sheep has got foot rot, if it's lame, it's very visible and it's bad. So if we can select against that, that's great. And public perception is going to be more and more important for us, I think. So these traits are really important because of that. And if I had a take-home message, if I wanted to tell you something, it would be that if you've got a ram breeder who doesn't record and select for these traits, especially worms, then they're really failing the sheep and the industry, and probably failing you as well in their duty, because I think that's the one that's really we're gonna have to really push forward on in the future. So yeah, that's from me. If anyone's got any questions. Yeah, you don't need that one unless you want to get arguments. You're on mute, Daniel.
I am. No, thank you very much, Tim. That was great. I think there'll be a few people on the call wondering what breeds went into the Exlana.
What breeds went into it?
Yeah.
Okay, so my standard answer to that is there were lots of different sheep, and we had data on them all, and I don't care what breed they were, but that's not what you want to hear. So the answer is on the wool shedding side, there were Wiltshire Horns, because I'd been recording them for 14, 15 years before we got into them. There were some Easy Cares, there were some Dorpers, some Catardins, some Barbados Black Bellies, and then on the other side, on the wool, and then we crossed them on woolly sheep, which were Clins and Dorsets, and Exmoor Mules and Berrichons, and I can't even remember. There were loads and loads of them. And basically we just put them in a mix and stirred the pot and recorded everything and brought the good ones out. Interestingly, it took a while to get to where we wanted to be. And the last time I looked at the flock on a kind of breed analysis point of view, we were most of the animals averaged about just under 70% woolly breeds. So it took us longer, but because we were selecting for more traits to get to where we wanted to be. Yeah,
interesting. Yeah, if we look over
and there's plenty other breeds gone in so since then we're moving composite. I see something I like, I buy it in. If there's a woolly sheep and it's got good parasite resistance, I go buy it and I use it. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
If we look over the pond at Australia, they're having a bit of a boom in the wool shedding sort of genetics, particularly kind of hair type ones. A lot of focus on Dorpers within like Aussie Whites and other breeds like that, which are, to be fair to a Dorper, has some pretty impressive performance stats on it, and they look, big muscular animals. How do you see them in this country? You hear problems with feet. Are they a big part of what you've done?
We've always had problems with feet with them. When we first started, I think we bought 6 rams. I think 2 we managed to sell at market as culls. The others got so bad on the feet that we had to take them direct to slaughter, or we had to shoot them on farm. So the Dorper has an incredible carcass, really good grower, great growth, nice muscling, but it's used to arid places, and its feet were really terrible, and it's not perfect at shedding. So it's horses for courses, isn't it? It's a different place. We live in a wet world.
It's a long way from home at this point.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
We've got a few questions here. One's asking, what's your lambing stocking density?
Okay, so the last year, I think that the twins and triplets were 12 to the acre, I think. So that was quite hard.
Okay.
That's me.
It's high. Yeah.
That's high. That's me. But that is not other people in the group would be in different situations and they'd be doing it differently.
What sort of covers would you be on when you're lambing? When are you lambing as well? What's your
I'm lambing beginning of April, when the grass starts to grow. Covers, crikey, I'm not very good at that kind of thing. You're talking 2-3 centimeters, something like that, and that soon disappears when you've got 10 to the acre in there. So but if they're lambing, if you've got a mob in there that are going to lamb within 10 days, 2 weeks, boom, it's done, and then you can open the gate and shift them out, can't you? And it's always a balance, because I do that sometimes and then I kind of cringe because I've just caused more problems than I wanted. So that selection pressure has to be balanced against welfare and keeping animals, getting enough animals alive so that I can make a living. So I've got a consultant vet who keeps me in line.
On that similar vein, I suppose we've got a question here about how do you measure mothering ability?
So mothering ability, so that's the only way I can measure mothering ability is so when I look at animals in the morning when I go round, I've got all my ewes painted up, pre-lambing, numbered with a spray 1 to 800 or whatever it is. And I drive round in the morning and I see that number 37 has lambed. I know that she's meant to have twins. She's got 2. That's great. Then when I go to tag them at 48 hours or something, one's disappeared. So I know she's a pretty crap mother. So that's our measure is birth to tagging of mothering ability.
Yeah, does she?
But it's difficult, isn't it? So was that her problem? Was that the lamb's problem? Lamb survival, so it's difficult to do.
Mm-hmm. I suppose there is another score would be sort of the flight score where you when you tag them, you rate how far away the ewe runs away.
Yeah, you can do that.
And some breeders do it. I know there was some research done, was it in Blackies up at Kirkton, and they did find a correlation between that mothering ability flight score and lamb survival, but only in the extreme 5-point score was only the top in the these are scored a 5. So only in the real wild Egypts was there actually an impact there. So it's not a perfect scoring system either.
So we're moving to DNA parentage now, and that is going to be so at lambing, it's completely hands off. I'm not going to be tagging them. So the only ones I'll note really are the ones that are complete idiots and bolt just because they can. So DNA parentage will limit some of the information we get there, I think.
When do you blood test sheep for IgA?
It's the same as FEC. So the animals need to be under or have been under pressure, so they have to have had a good worm burden. It's not as important as when you're doing FEC. So when I'm doing FEC, I'm trying to get mob counts of about 1,000 before I do individual FECs, because that's where I want the pressure to be, so that there are animals with really high FEC counts and those with really low ones. So there's a good variation. With IgA, I think all they want is that they want them to have been under a reasonable amount of pressure, so 300, 400, 500 eggs per gram, something like that. And so we're doing it when we know that the animals start to show more individual resistance. So as they get older, when they're very young, when they're 8 weeks old, they don't really show much resistance to parasites because they haven't had a challenge. So by the time they get to 4 or 5 months old, they've had a really good challenge at least once or twice or 3 times. So that's the kind of time that we do it then. And I try to do it at the same time as when I'm kind of muscle and back fat scanning and weighing, because then we've got a whole load of information that all links at one time, correlates at one time. Plus I can do it all on one day and I don't have to gather them again. But that's what I try to do.
I think there was some hopes as well. FECs, individual FECs, I don't know if people are familiar, but it's not the most enjoyable job to do. So good on any breeder that does it. But there was also hope perhaps that whilst you're looking at the IgA, which is a blood test, which also comes with expense and intervention, there was kind of hopes for maybe that saliva would work, but I don't think it's quite there, is it?
So no, we trialed saliva for a couple of years, but so the good thing about IgA is that it's got good repeatability. So if you test one animal today and then the next day, it's pretty bang on. It's got almost identical counts one day after the other. Whereas saliva didn't have that. So they've given up on, they seem to have given up on saliva, and we've been advised to use IgA. But with all these things, all these things, whenever they come out, the scientists get very excited about them and tell us it's the answer to everything. And then after a couple of years, you start to find out where the pitfalls are, and you have to moderate expectations. But which is where we've been with IGA as well. We've moderated our expectations, but they're still pretty good. They're better than FEC at the moment. That's what we do. But we're doing both so that we can continue to correlate one with the other. And then we'll see where we get to with it in a few years.
And do you feel that you find that you're high FEC or you're high IGA as well? Generally, you've seen good correlation.
So this is interesting. So that they're trialing this. Originally, there were a lot of clean breeders, the progressive clean breeding group. I think there are a couple of Romney breeders as well, and then the Exlana guys. And with the Exlanas, there was quite a high correlation between the FEC and the IGA, whereas with the thins, there wasn't such. Well, I don't think there was much correlation at all.
I thought that.
Which kind of flummoxed us. And the suggestion is that because we've put more selection pressure on selecting for animals that are resistant, we've got further down the line. So those, we've got better results. The other thing is that actually IGA is looking at the antibody response to one species, TC comcerca, which is one of the most pathogenic ones, but it might be that we have more of them than the other farms in the Flynn group, or vice versa. So yeah, it's never as simple as you think it's going to be. But it goes in the right direction. Yeah,
Keeps it interesting anyway.
Yeah.
Let's scroll down. I suppose a good tie-in as well with our previous webinar on fly strike, and also next month's webinar, looking at, do you score breach? So do you score for a sort of breach bareness or other traits associated?
Yeah, so we got so you'll see on the on my slide about scoring for tails, I got a 1 to 5 measure there. So then we've got, so all I do then is animals with a clean breech rather than a dirty breech, rather than the fluffy breech. I just give them instead of being, if it was 3, I just give them 31 instead. And so then when I come down, then I've got a selection of clean breeched animals. So quite crude, but these measurements are quite crude because they're quite easy to see, aren't they? It's not as if I have to get scales to do it. So that's what we do. And then of course you've just got to select on those animals really. And that's the bit that's hard to do, because they're not always the animals that grow well, or they've got foot rot, or they've got whatever else they've got wrong with them.
I suppose that was my next question. We've talked about probably, half a dozen or a dozen of these sort of welfare functional, phenotypic traits that you can record visually, along with all the welfare traits. How do you balance all these traits along with the performance as well in your selection?
And
they're not all the EBVs, as we've said.
Yeah, exactly. Well, with difficulty. So, I mean, personally, the way I do it, so we incorporate FEC and IGA into our index by putting a weighting on it, which I don't think anybody else does in their analysis yet. And the way that I do it really is that if I've got a trait I'm specifically looking at, so over the last few years I've been interested in tail, then I create a marking system on the tails, and EBV, which will probably only, and I do this myself, I just take into consideration the sire and the dams data and the lambs data, and then I create a ranking just on that one trait, and I add that to the index, and I put whatever weighting I want to put on it. so that an animal with an index of 150 that would be in the top, let's say 10% or something, if that ram actually had a shorter tail, then he'd go up to 155. If he came down, and if he had a longer tail, he'd come down to 145. So I do that, but then at the end of the day, you've got to balance it all out. And so if I'm selecting rams for myself, and I'll be doing this tomorrow, going through ram lambs that might be good for breeding next year. I've used some, but there might be others. I kind of pull all the high index ones out, and then I just chuck them in the pen, and I keep throwing them out because they'll, they won't be right. Their feet won't be right. Their legs won't be right. The teeth won't be right. Whatever it is, won't be right with them. So you've got to balance it, haven't you? It's all that stuff. And the more things you select on, the slower the progress in overall. Or no, the slower the progress in any one trait. But so yeah, it just depends what you want. Which is why breeding for terminal size is so easy, because all you want is something that grows like stink and's got a big ass, and so that's all you select.
Cautious of time. I think we said Q2. We're now on 44. We'll maybe just rattle through a few questions. We've got a question here. I'll just take it. Does vaccination for foot rot aid or hinder selection for resistance? And ultimately, it will hinder it because it'll reduce your
variation. Hinders it undoubtedly. Yeah,
you want them to express it. And in any case, what we see in the traits, which we spoke about it with Laura Green in the previous webinar, the foot rot under clinical trials, the foot rot vaccines only actually reduce incidence by about 20%, or in higher cases 30%. So it's not even, there still will be variation there, but it's going to hinder that expression. What's your thought on white sheep with white noses in their feet? I would certainly back up the concept that.
No, I'm looking at it now. That's David. Hi, David. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's ridiculous. I've never known any correlation between white noses and bad feet. Somebody sent me a kind of very loose study looking at it on 2 flocks in New Zealand, and there was no correlation at all. But I can't convince anybody of that. So people still tell me they will not have sheep with white noses and white feet.
Yeah. Someone has asked here quite a large question. Is it possible to still achieve genetic development with a pure/pedigree flock, or is it hybrid crossing a definitive requirement? I've been recording worm burden and removing from the flock, and it feels like I'm already making a tiny bit of difference, but not sure if I'll come to a stop as I'm not crossing out.
The more sheep you've got, the more diversity you've got, then the better chance you've got of breeding for any trait. So, and I'll give you an example. So decades ago, we had Wiltshire horns, pedigree Wiltshire horns on a farm I worked on. We had 250 of them. We recorded them, performance recorded them. And because they'd never been performance recorded as a breed before, or no serious work had been done on them, we made quite rapid progress in the essential things like growth rate, carcass quality, and also fecundity, so scanning percentage. And I can't remember exactly what it was, but we went from something like scanning at 1.6 to 1.8 in about 7 years, and then we leveled off, and then and that kind of leveled off for 3 years, and then we persuaded other people to get involved with it as well. This is all within a pedigree population. And we got another 500 animals recorded. And as soon as we started using those genetics, then our fecundity increased again. So the more animals you use, then the more chance you've got of finding something good. But you don't have to crossbreed to do that. It'll increase just bringing other animals in will increase your chance of finding something good, won't it? Really, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yep, just be able to capitalise some of that variation. I think we'll just stop on now. Final question. Thanks everyone for inundated with questions here. So final question, Tim. Are you scoring tail length at birth, or are you leaving the lambs undocked and scoring them later? When do you choose to score them?
I do them. I've just done them. So at when I was weighing them recently, I did them. It doesn't matter when you do them really. But I find doing them later easier because they're coming in to be weighed in the crate so that I can see them from behind. It's very easy to see how long they are without bending down so far. And I've got a weight and I record on my my electronic system. It'll say that the animal weighs 38 kilos, and then it comes up for body condition score, and I just record a body condition score, which actually is my tail length. So yeah, I'll just do it later on.
Perfect. And maybe just one last question, just maybe with some value for people thinking about going to wool shedding genetics. If on the first cross or even the second cross, when do you think, at what age people should select replacements in terms of their shedding ability? When do you think there's a good expression in a ewe lamb to start picking out culls?
Okay, so it's I would say so wool shedding is better measured it gives you a more accurate prediction when it's measured as an adult.
Yeah.
Rather than as a lamb, but you gotta push that against when you want to cull them, when you want to thin them out. But you will, like everything, the best time to measure it is when there is most variation. So halfway through the flocks shedding, when there's a few that have shed completely and a few that haven't done anything at all, and most of them are halfway in between. Yeah, there's no good answer to that really. It's you got to fit it in when you can do it, and the first year or two you just have to keep whatever you can. Yeah, a lot of people buy. A lot of people tend to buy a dozen or 20 full shedders to see if they like them, see if they can get on with them. And there are, that's good. But actually, if you've done any work on your sheep on your farm and they're suited to where you farm, you don't really want to go and buy a whole load of sheep in from somewhere else. You want to breed. If you've got a good sheep and the only thing you want to change is the wool, you want to breed the wool off them, don't you?
Yeah, spot on. That's great. Thank you very much, Tim, for a really informative evening and for doing so many questions as well. So thanks for coming along, and thanks everyone for joining us tonight. And we'll call it a night now. So thank you. Good night.